Hello, my name is Daphene McFerren, and I am the Executive Director of the Benjamin L. Hooks Institute for Social Change at the University of Memphis. Thank you for joining us for this interview with author Faye Duncan, an esteemed children's book author. Before we get to Ms. Duncan and her book, Evicted, I'd like to ask you to stay in touch with the Hooks Institute by liking us on our Facebook page. You can also follow us on other media, which includes Twitter and Instagram. Finally, you can join our mailing list. We're going to put the link where you can connect with us and receive our mailings, updates, and announcement of events from the Hooks Institute. The Hooks Institute's mission is teaching, studying, and promoting civil rights and social change. And books which explore civil rights history and responsible citizenship are core to the Hooks Institute's values. So a little background on Ms. Duncan. Faye Duncan is a national board educator who writes books for young learners. Her primary motivation is to help children remember forgotten historical moments that will build courage, dignity, and determination. Alice received her undergraduate degree in English from the University of Memphis, and she earned her master's degree in library information science from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. She is the author of many important books, which include Martin and the Mountaintop, which was awarded a Coretta Scott King Honor Medal for illustrations. Alice's most recent books include Opal Lee, The True Story of the Grandmother of Juneteenth, and Evicted, The Struggle for the Right to Vote in Fayette County, Tennessee. Evicted is very close to my heart because it tells the story of the civil rights movement in Fayette County, where I was born, and also my parents were seminal leaders of that movement. Alice's book does a fantastic job of telling the stories of other people who were core to the success of that movement. We welcome Faye Duncan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hi, Alice.
Hey.
So just give me a little background on why you decided to write children's books.
Okay, so I've been a school librarian for 29 years, right? And over the course of that time, as I'm sharing books with children, I clearly see where there are gaps in the literature, where there are subjects that have not been addressed that children need to know. So, for example, I wrote Memphis, Martin, and the Mountaintop because I had discovered when I spoke to children in schools, none of them could tell me why King was in Memphis. They could all tell me where King was killed, but they could not tell me why he was in Memphis. And they could not give me some kind of hypothesis as to why he was killed. And so I wrote that book over the course of 10 years. The same reason that I wrote that book is the reason why I wrote Evicted, The Struggle for the Right to Vote, which looks at the tent city Fayette County voting rights struggle. There was at the time, as of today, and until January 11th, when the book will be released, there has been no book for young people that clearly states why this movement is important. I live 50 miles away from Fayette County. And so I decided I wanted to write that story for children so that they would have it. And also, a lot of adults don't know the importance of the Fayette County voting movement and why we should owe tribute and recognition to those Black sharecroppers. And so I wrote the book also for adults.
Okay, so tell us briefly, what was the Fayette County movement? How did it start? And
how does it start? Okay, so the Fayette County voting rights movement, it starts in 1959 with the trial of Burton Dodson. Burton Dodson was a Black man from Fayette County who had been accused of killing a white man during a lynch mob when white folks were trying to murder him. So there's a trial for him. He had actually, the lynch mob against Burton Dodson took place in 1940. Burton Dodson, in a explosion of gunfire, He's shot 5 times. The legend is he was shot 5 times in an explosion of gunfire with this white mob after him, and he runs 50 miles to Memphis, right? And then he goes to Chicago, and then he settles in East St. Louis, where he lives for 18 years. 18 years he lives, no problem. But then in 1958, he is arrested, and they ship him back to Fayette County to be tried for this murder of this white man that he did not do, okay? And when the trial happens, for the first time in Fayette County history, you have a Black lawyer who comes to town to try a case in Fayette County. There had never been a Black lawyer in the Fayette County courthouse before 1959 to try a case. You have all of these sharecroppers who have gathered there to hear the man, the lawyer who is J.F. Estes. They have gathered to hear the trial of Burton Dodson. They immediately want to be one of his peers on the jury. And J.F. Estes tells them, you won't be considered for this jury. Why not? Because none of you are registered to vote. Therein is the problem. Why is it in 1959, these Black sharecroppers, good mothers and fathers earning a living, taking care of their families, why had they not been registered to vote? And John McFerren is, John McFerren is inspired at that time that this is a crime and a sin and a shame that no one has been registered to vote. And he decides at that time to work with Estes to start a voting rights registration drive. But the reason why the people in Fayette County, only 50 miles away from Memphis, had not decided to vote or had never voted is because there was a cloud of racial terror that surrounded Fayette County and the nearby Haywood County.
You said that John McFerren, and I have to say, for full disclosure, he is my father, yes, was one of the principal leaders of the movement. The other principal leader of the movement in 1959 was Hartman Jamison. They were later joined by their wives shortly after they started, which was Minnie Harris Jamison, and Viola Harris McFerren, and they were sisters. Sisters married to Viola to John and Minnie to Hartman Jamison. And I'd like to point out, as you point out in your book, that there were many other people involved in the registration effort, African Americans, who joined under that leadership to create change and the right to vote. How did you present this story? You have a central character, James Jamison. And James, you tell us who James is and how you present him as a central character to tell the story in this children's book.
Okay, so Evicted begins with the story of James Jamerson, who I call James Jr. James Jamerson is an actual person, actually. He is the nephew to Minnie Jamison and Hartman Jamison, and he's your cousin, by the way. James is a kid. He's like a 9-year-old kid when the movement starts. And when I was drafting the story, I wanted to write it from the perspective of a young person, but I could not find I had yet to find a young person. So I was doing all these interviews. I had a time where I was interviewing James, and James began to tell me how he grew up in the movement, right? And that was what he would always say. I grew up in the movement, right? And so one day I said, hey, can you share with me your some family photo albums so that I can just see? I just wanted to be transported in time to see how they were dressed, who they were, what was the home life like? What was it like living on a farm? I'm from the city. I'd never lived on a farm. I've been to a farm, have relatives that live in Eats and things, but just had never been saturated into like living on the farm. I wanted to see what that was like. And when he showed me these pictures of his family, when he showed me pictures of James Jr. with his little dog at 9 years old, James Jr. on his horse with his uncle, at 10 years old, these photographs made me realize that I could form a fictional character around these real events and make James Jr. my main character. Also, James Jr. had struggled with the death of his sister when he was very young. And so that also gave me some kind of conflict to begin and enter with my story. And so it was just, he was the spirit. I say he was the spirit, the breath, that sort of helped me shape the story.
Okay. So James Jr. is the nephew of Hopman and Minnie Jameson, but he's also was adopted by them, legally adopted. So he is their son. Mm-hmm. And so how was, in terms of approaching children, how did you shape the story through James' experiences to teach some seminal lesson? And what was that lesson?
Okay, so James Jr., the man, is a very quiet spirit. James Jr., the kid, had suffered the death of his sister when he was like 6. He had suffered, you said that he was adopted. He was adopted specifically because there was one day when he was like 5 years old, his mother and his father abandon their home and they leave James Jameson in the home with his little sister alone until they are found by his grandmother. So there is this there's this theme of abandonment, but there's also this theme of being quiet and not ready to speak, because he's very reflective, right? But then there is, at some point, after witnessing his aunt lose her job for the sake of voting, after witnessing his uncle, not be able to get loans at the bank now because of his determination to vote, at seeing his father do the same thing, with him seeing the activism and with him having friendships with the white college kids who come to Fayette County to help in the movement. All of these things, galvanize and come together so that by the time, in real life, by the time James Jameson reaches high school and there is the case of integrating the Fayette County schools, James Jameson decides on his own, with no probing and prodding from his parents, he decides that he wants to be one of the first students to integrate the high school. So he goes through childhood. He works at the McFerren grocery store. I say, Mr. James, did you talk to the people often? He said, no. I said, did your parents ever talk to you about civil rights? No, we never talked about it. He said, I just saw them live it. And when it was my opportunity to do something, then I did.
Okay, so I had the privilege of reading a preview of your book before it was released. And It would it be fair to say there are 2 stories in it? One story is how Black people, African-American people, embrace their community and even children. I mean, it's not unusual in African-American Southern communities for us to take children in and raise them as our own. So that's
no, that is the way of the African-American family, of the immigrant family. That is the way of the human spirit. You make do with what you have.
And the second story is the civil rights, social political story, which is the right to vote. All right, so you have 2 stories in the book. And what would be the takeaway for not only children, but for adults from these sort of 2 storylines in your book?
Okay,
so it's relevant. What is this relevance to people today?
That you have to use your voice. That is very key to me. And that is what I try to demonstrate through the character James Jr., that, he sort of rendered muted after the tragedy of his sister's death. But then one day he decides, he knows that the people are marching in the town in Fayette County, and he simply leaves school, knowing there's a penalty that he might be, charged with skipping school, but he leaves school and he goes to participate in the march and the singing as they protest integration. So it is to children, it is that you are never too young to use your voice. You are never too young to walk in your personal agency, your personal power, and your personal privilege to help others. Because here's the thing, people like Hartman Jameson, people like your dad, John McFerren, they owned land. So unlike the sharecroppers who were evicted from the land because they dared to vote, James and John, Shepherd Tolles, who actually allowed evicted families to live on his land, they could not be evicted from their land because they owned their property. So they were Black people, say it with me, they were Black people with privilege, because Black people got privilege too, right? Yes. And so they used Shepherd Tolles. He had 200 acres of land. He said, okay, we've got 30 families here in his immediate area that had been evicted. And he says, you know, many of you all can come and stay with me, because a lot of the sharecroppers did not have families that they could just move into a home with, right? And so he says, I have this property. It is here. We can pitch tents and you can stay here. And some of those families who decided that they wanted to vote and they were evicted because of it, some of them stayed in those tents on Shepherd Tolles' property for 2 years.
In your book, you have a very detailed bibliography. Mm-hmm. And I'm proud to say, and this is a shout out for Hooks, that you do cite the website that we did on the story of the civil rights movement in Fayette County and the creation of Tent City for those African Americans who were evicted from white farms because they registered to vote. And the website, in case our viewers would like to look at it, is memphis.edu/Tent City. So your bibliography refers to the website. It refers to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was passed under the leadership of President Johnson. It is very detailed. In fact, it really is an adult bibliography on how voting has emerged historically in our country from in that period of the 1960s. Why such a detailed bibliography in a children's book?
Well, first of all, you know, the Tennessee Department of Education includes Tent City in its history curriculum for the 5th grade and for the 11th grade. And so even though this book is considered a historical fiction, I wanted it to be completely steeped into the events that happened, which is why I interviewed at least 10 primary sources of people who were a part of Tent City, or either they had family members who were a part of Tent City. And so I just wanted the book to be steeped in primary sources and the actual events that happened in Tent City. I'm really, there is one book that I did not put in the bibliography because I did not discover this book until after the book was published, but that is Dr. Barbara Ransby's. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, but she, in her book on Ella Baker, she does a whole chapter about Ella Baker and Tent City, which helped my proposal, because I have always said since doing the research that without Tent City and those Black sharecroppers in Fayette County, you do not get John Lewis and the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And without those sharecroppers, not only do you not get John Lewis and the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but without John Lewis and the Edmund Pettus Bridge, you do not get the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so now that the Voting Rights Act has been gutted and voters don't have a lot of protection under the law, you know, I clearly want kids and adults to understand we now need the Freedom to Vote Act to pass. And so the onus, of course, is on adults to work toward making that act pass. But my book allows children to understand their responsibility in this movement that continues, that it is on them to make sure that voters have protection under the law, that this is also their struggle, because this is about their vote.
Yes. And, we have limited time here. And I only point that out to say that you do a very good job of talking about the role African-American women in Fayette County played in leadership. So we're highlighting a few people who were seminal to the movement, but your book also discusses how Black women were so critical to the movement and to the uplifting of their families. So Alice, let's talk about the book itself and the beautiful illustrations which help tell the story.
Charlie Palmer in Atlanta is the illustrator.
Explain the book cover and its relevance to the story.
Well, the book cover is actually a remix of Ernest Withers' photograph of Mary Williams and her husband, Early B. Williams, and their children. Mary Williams and Early B., they were the first family to move in the tents on Shepherd Toll's property when they were evicted and displaced because they dared to register and vote in Fayette County. Mary Williams, I want to also add, is still alive. I spoke with her in great detail to interview her about her participation in the movement. And I keep up with her. I usually speak with her maybe about every 2 or 3 months or so to keep her in the loop on the progress of the book. And a very special lady, very determined lady who was also inspired by Viola McFerren, who is your mother, as they supported their spouses, in this movement.
Miss Williams and her husband, Early B. Williams, was the first family in Fayette County to be evicted in the winter of 1960, and it was on Mr. Toll's farm, Shepherd Toll's farm. All right. Another illustration that is seminal to the book.
Another one is the illustration that shows the several tents that are pitched on Shepherd Toll's property. So the egregious thing, besides being evicted because you chose to be a citizen and vote, another egregious thing is that these tents that you see, these army tents that were pitched in the field for the evicted families, these very army tents that sat outside in inclement weather, many of them did not have flooring. There was mud in the tents. It was cold in the tents. These tents were oftentimes much more comfortable and safe than the sharecropper shacks that the sharecroppers were evicted from. And so I want the kids to see the tents, but I also make note in the book how sometimes the sharecropper shack was not as hospitable as the tents themselves.
Yes. You also use poems or language other than just a narrative to bring the story to life.
Yes.
Yeah, poetry. So explain how you use that in the book.
Okay, so here's the thing. Okay, so when you're writing for children and you are talking about these very deep ideas like lynching, because what we have to understand is that in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, lynching, racial terror in Fayette County and Haywood County was rampant. Okay, so in Haywood County, they had a Black state legislature. In Haywood County, they had a Black state legislator who ended up he was run out of town. They threatened to lynch him. And when this terror happens to him, that's the cue to everybody, every Black person in Haywood County. Okay, act like you want to vote. We're going to run you out of town or we're going to lynch you. This is the late 1800s, right? And then in Fayette County, there was a lynching in 1915 of a man named Thomas Brooks. What is the theme here? Do anything that we disagree with and we will kill you. Well, this cloud, this spirit of how things are going to be, the status quo, is the message that Black people in Fayette County and Haywood County had internalized for years since the end of American slavery, okay? And I need to talk about this because ultimately I want kids to know that why were those folks in 1959 not on the voters' roll? Why had they not been voting? They had not been voting because racial terror was a part of their subconscious sky. They knew that we do anything that is in a disagreement with the white status quo. There is the Ku Klux Klan in Haywood County. There is the White Citizens Council in Fayette County, and there will be reprisals, right? And so I want to talk about this, but it's heavy. Lynching, mob lynching, racial terror, that's heavy, right? Not too heavy for a high school student, which this book is also geared toward, but it's very heavy for a second grader. So this book is really geared for the upper elementary student. But the way to broach the heavy idea is poetry. Something rhythmic, something lyrical, something concise. And so because I knew I was meeting with you today, I actually recorded the poem that speaks of the lynching of Thomas Brooks. And if we can, I'll share it with you now. The Ghost of Thomas Brooks. My talk, it ain't polished. Listen anyway. This is my body, battered and bruised. See my bulging eye? Call me Tom Brooks, here and not here. I am the wind. Click, click. A crowd of grinning white folks snap my picture. Kodak Brownie cameras cost $2. It is April 1915. My cracked black boots and broken black limbs dangle from the trestle of a railroad bridge in Somerville. I killed a rich white farmer and his helper, they say. They say so much that ain't true. Click, click. Pictures tell the story as buzzing white children chirp with glee. They is so happy to miss a day of school and dance in circles at the hanging of a nigger. Me. My story, it ain't polished. Read it anyway. Study my broken body like a book. Remember my blues. Here and not here. I am wind, rain, and beloved sun. Colored folk was the majority in Fayette County, Tennessee. We stayed on the land and picked cotton after slavery days. We was cheated paupers in plantation shacks, sharecroppers. Colored men did not vote in 1915 or beyond, not in Fayette County. My muted tongue and broken black body is a message down the dusty tracks of time. What is the lesson for my wounded soul? Go make some white folk mad, or do good, like open a grocery, learn yourself to read, or cast your ballot as a first-class citizen. It ain't no secret. They will kill you.
So Alice, you've given us a lot of information about how you approach the issue of voting, voter intimidation, especially when voters are African American in Fayette County and historically in other parts of the country. When one reads your book, what hope is there for the future about equality, inclusion, that you would like the reader, either a child or an adult, to take away from this book?
Well, in the epilogue of the book, the final part of the book, I explain how the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has now been gutted, and it does not hold the efficacy and the power for voter protection that it did 50 years ago. And so when the child or the adult gets to the end of my book, what they understand is that now the baton of John McFerren, Viola McFerren, Minnie Jameson, Hartman Jameson, the baton has been passed to the child, and the baton has been passed to adult. The struggle for the right to vote and to live is a never-ending struggle. And therefore, it is now this generation's time to do their part to make justice and liberty available for all. Remember Tent City.
Beautifully said. Okay, final note. We have viewers who are across the country. Where can people go on a website to purchase this book if they're located anywhere other than Tennessee or Memphis? Mm-hmm. And how can local people in Memphis purchase your book?
I would suggest that local people in Memphis, local people in Nashville, wherever you find yourself living, I would suggest that you purchase the book from a local bookseller. What does that mean? You can go to your bookseller's website and you can find the book, because this book, Evicted, The Struggle for the Right to Vote, is sold wherever books are sold. Okay, so I encourage you to purchase it from a local bookseller, because when we keep dollars local, those dollars are employing local citizens, and they are going back, those dollars are going back into the community. So wherever books are sold locally, that is where I would encourage you to purchase the book, online or in a store.
Well, Alice, thank you so much for your time today. And I really encourage viewers to get the book. It is a children's book, but as I read the pre-release of the book that was provided to me, it's clear to me it's also an adult book when you get to the bibliography. And you do such a fantastic job of going through the legislative history of voting and how our government, our politicians are so critical to helping ensure that the rights of local communities are protected. And we need to have people in those offices who are sensitive to these issues and are working toward a more just nation. So we wish you the best of luck with this book, and we look forward to following you in your other publications. And thank you so much for your work in creating Evicted.
Oh, might I add, if there are people who want to know more about my other books, they can reach me at AliceFayeDuncan.com, AliceFaye Duncan.com. Thank you.
Thank you.